Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Rose LaRosa's Town, Women's Labor on the Toledo Burlesque Stage. We're going to give it just a moment as our participants load in, and then we'll get started. Okay, well, welcome to our webinar, Rose LaRosa's Town, Women's Labor on the Toledo Burlesque Stage. I am Dr. Beth Cattleman, curator of the Jerome Lawrence and Robert E. Lee Theater Research Institute, and I have just a bit of information for you today before we get started. Audio and video are muted for all attendees. Please submit questions in the Q&A box. Chat can be used for general comments and discussion. Closed captioning can be enabled by clicking the CC button. Today's session is being recorded for future viewing, and some of the slides contained in today's presentation may be adult in nature. And now I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Wellman. Dr. Wellman, a Department of Theater faculty member at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, is a historian and theater maker whose work centers intersectional voices and experiences. Wellman's current research interrogates workers' rights and safety through the history of American chorus girls, an historically unprotected group whose financial and physical precarity demonstrates larger systemic issues of the American stage. In this webinar, Dr. Wellman will discuss her new book project on the career of burlesque star Rose LaRose. Wellman is the foremost authority on LaRose, and she is currently conducting research at the Theater Research Institute using the Charles H. McKay collection of exotic dance from burlesque to clubs. Wellman's project is supported by the Theater Research Institute's Visiting Researcher Award. And if you're interested in finding out more about that and potentially applying for one yourself, we will drop a link into the chat. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Wellman.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much to Ohio State, to Special Collections, to Dr. Cattleman for having me. I'm delighted to be here. When I was told I only got an hour total, including questions, I felt immediately heartbroken because there's just no way I can tell you all of the things that I want to tell you. So I'm going to dive in. I know that I'm going to miss information that's interesting probably to you in regards to burlesque history. So please feel free to ask some questions in the chat or via the Q&A box. I'll do my best to answer. Certainly there's plenty that I don't know, and I'd be happy to try to find out for you. And if you have any other questions, I know we have folks on here that are responding via chat. So today I'm going to talk about Rose LaRosa's work specifically in the Toledo scene, on the Toledo burlesque stage. And I'm focusing this talk on women's labor, and I'm going to look specifically at some of the materials that I've been studying this month in the special collections. And I want to kind of talk about what I see as part of an untold story in women's labor. I've titled this Rose LaRosa's Town Hall, but actually the Ohio State tagline has been Rose LaRosa's Town, and that's actually more appropriate given that I'm going to talk about her second theater, which was not the Town Hall, it was the Esquire, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So essentially my project utilizes the archival methodologies of material culture scholarship, and this project is centering women's labor practices through the lens of 1960s burlesque performance. My research covers a much broader span, but today I'm going to be focusing largely on the late 1960s. The image, in case you're curious, at the top is a picture of Rose LaRose from her office, I believe in the town hall in the early 1960s. So what do I mean when I say burlesque? That word conjures up a lot. Here's a couple great examples of what that looks like, at least in some of my research. So on the left, you'll see Nudema, great name. who actually, I believe, did appear at Rose LaRosa's theater. And on the right, Patty Jean Shaw. This is from a men's magazine, I believe, from the late 1950s. You can see a couple of images of dancers and sort of what we would expect to see at this period of burlesque. But largely what we're talking about burlesque in the 20th century is, I would say, humor-filled striptease, performance, dance, elements of comedy, elements of acrobatics, often gimmicks, a lot of live animal acts and puppets and elaborate stage costuming, sets, effects, and so on. So stripping, but kind of extra flashy, maybe is a good way to put that. But I will say, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, that I, along with many scholars, would say that burlesque is often put in a box separate from what we think of now when we talk about exotic dance or stripping, when in fact, really, it's a continuum of performance modes. And some of the dancers who work within burlesque during this time in history in the 60s would consider themselves artists, performers, and many of them actually considered themselves closer to sex workers. And in many ways, those two worlds overlap significantly. And so one of the things I want to acknowledge is the way that women's labor, particularly on the burlesque stage, is complex. And I don't want to either ignore the realities of women's lived experiences, nor do I want to make assumptions about what they did or why they did it. I'll talk more about that. So why burlesque? Why am I studying it? Besides the fact I think it's really cool. A few things. There's 154 plus years of historical practice of burlesque in the United States. I think of burlesque as an American art form, although it certainly has roots both in the UK and France, as well as many other places. It's often marked as an American art form, and I think, therefore, it allows us to think about American culture and identity in a very interesting way. It crosses geography and class. That's one of the things I find most fascinating about burlesque from the 1860s on, is the way that people from across social status would enjoy a burlesque show, and the ways in which it toured. We'll talk about touring and the significance of that. It's often situated as popular, and popular often has a sheen of disrespect about it. But because it's popular, I think it can say something to us about audiences, tastes. The idea of it being popular versus good or high art, I think, makes it an interesting art form to study. It's also situated simultaneously as artistic, which I think is the fun tension in burlesque, as it is in many popular art forms like vaudeville, like circus, and so on. It's a uniquely gendered kind of labor. Though there are a lot of male comics in burlesque, Red Skelton, Bob Hope are among the performers who got their start in burlesque. The primary labor, I would say, of burlesque on the stage is done by women, and yet it's frequently a male-dominated place in terms of production. It intersects heavily with sex work throughout time, even early in what we would think of as burlesque history. And this is a bold claim, but I think it defies its own demise. You can look at newspaper articles from any era of burlesque, and I mean starting in the late 1800s forward, in which people are immediately telling you burlesque is dead. It used to be so great, and now it's terrible. Now it's just trash, smut. It's nothing. And that never changes. So there's frequently periods of time where people say, this is the golden age of burlesque. But very quickly, someone else will say, no, it was better in, 1924 or whenever. This continues to happen. It happens even now with neo-burlesque. Why Rose LaRose? Why am I studying Rose? it's sort of an accident that I met her. And what I mean met her, I mean I found her in an archive, right? And encountering her images, encountering her notes, her handwritten notes, I was just struck by the particular kind of person that she was, and the kind of professional she was. This is actually an image of Rose LaRose with her mother, Jenny. I want to tell you a little bit about her. This biography is going to be incredibly brief. I could obviously talk about her much longer. But she was born in 1916 in Brooklyn, New York. I've now verified that, by the way. I finally found some census records that verify her date of birth. She was born Rosina DePello, and her parents were Italian and Argentinian immigrants. So her mother, Giovannini, immigrated from Italy, and her father, Carlo DePello, immigrated from Argentina, but his family of origin was from Italy. And they immigrated, I believe Carlo probably immigrated around 1898, somewhere in there. He and Giovannini got married around 1912. Rosina attended school until she was 15. She actually says in an interview in the 60s, 14 and a half. Well, she often shaves a year off her age or adds one, you never really know. She did some cashier training and some stenographer training, and then she got a job at Minsky's Burlesque in New York, in Brooklyn. And that's really where she begins her career. We talk about this term entering an occupation. I can talk more about that. People have questions in the Q&A, but in roughly 1934, it's likely that it was 1934. It could have been earlier, potentially. 1934 is the earliest date of a program that I have located. Her stage name, Rose LaRose, was given to her. The mythology is that a sign painter couldn't fit her whole name onto the board, and so he just changed it to Rose LaRose. Whether that's true or whether Minsky renamed her, it's not entirely clear. We do know she didn't like the name, and that at one point she tried to change it to Connie Ray, and she was dancing under that name at Leon and Eddie's. But when Walter Winchell, the gossip columnist, found out, he immediately spilled the beans in the paper. Everybody showed up to see Rose LaRose. And she said that taught her the value of her name. And I believe the quote is, she said, and I in turn taught it to the trade. And so from that point on, she embraced her name. She would later legally change her name. That is actually the name that is on her headstone today. In terms of her performance style, she was constantly innovating. She's sort of famous for having a new act all the time. She would try to do things with technology. She would experiment with stage effects. She had a Valentine's Day show once where her part of her brassiere, her corset, had a light up heart with a battery pack inside of it. So at the end of her act, it would flash. And yeah, she thought that was very cool. She did a lot of stuff like that. She was constantly incorporating pop culture, current events into her act. In one act, she actually holds a giant newspaper from the day out in front of her, mostly unclothed body. And as she reads the headlines to the audience, she folds it more and more. I would say that a lot of her work is characterized by both her American citizenship and her American patriotism. That's a complicated thing to say, and I'd be happy to talk more about that, but I have reasons for thinking that. She experimented heavily with music, which is frequently talked about in the press, and that becomes important later. She was often marked as edgy or raunchy as a performer. In fact, she was arrested or fined multiple times for indecent acts. She was not the only dancer to experience that, but she was often blamed for theaters being shuttered and so on. She was often called the undisputed queen of burlesque, which is a hard thing for anyone to really say, because there were many undisputed queens of burlesque. However, I think it's pretty clear that she had a remarkably successful career. I would place it roughly between 1934 and 1958. There's a year or two in there where I don't want to say she's unaccounted for, but she seems to have stepped away from performing live. She was doing work in Hollywood, trying to break into the film industry. She did tour internationally. She lived and worked bi-coastally. 1937, LaGuardia famously banned burlesque within the New York City limits. And so a lot of dancers left New York City, and burlesque in some ways moved with it. Rose found herself in LA for a period of time, but then she began a pretty lengthy Midwestern tour repeatedly for many years, which I think impacts why she ends up in Toledo. She was in at least 2 films. They are called The Wages of Sin, which is a very, very small scene, and Queen of Burlesque, 1946 with Evelyn Ankers, in which she plays a character named Blossom Terrain, who is, spoiler alert, murdered backstage very, very quickly. And the rest of the movie is spent trying to figure out who did it. But she famously was also the advisor for the film because she was the only actual burlesque dancer in the movie. She did advertisements for both Pepsi and for Cool cigarettes, among other business ventures. Her name and likeness are featured in a 1941 Donald Duck cartoon. If you've ever seen the episode where Donald Duck sees a sign for Rose LaRose, goes into the theater, and then ends up sticking around to watch the show. It's rumored, I have not been able to definitively confirm this, that she was friends with Walt Disney from her time in California. And that's something I'm still looking into. She was the subject of frequent tabloid gossip. And she became quickly synonymous with what I would call sex iconography from the 1940s and 1950s. In fact, in some newspapers, she's compared or put in the same breath as people like Tempest Storm or even Marilyn Monroe. Why Toledo? Why Toledo? Surviving material records, that's a big reason. Through sheer luck, but also the generous support of both the public libraries and then several university libraries, including the ones in Toledo and here at Ohio State. We have a lot of records from Toledo theater, which makes studying it and thinking about it important. The centrality of Ohio in business and in theater, because of its location. You have a lot of trade, you have a lot of industry, you have a lot of people traveling through. It's close to the coast, but it isn't the coast. It's a meeting place, particularly for those who are in agriculture or more rural places. But you have a lot of show business going through Toledo. Toledo is a theater town. At one point, there are, I don't know, 6 or more theaters operating at the same time in Toledo. And I think that speaks to the kind of place Toledo was and its embrace of art and popular entertainment. The art form, the burlesque art form, survives in Toledo longer than it does, or I should say in a more contained way than it does in other parts of the country. So oftentimes you'll see people saying that in New York and in San Francisco, the country had moved on from burlesque by the 60s. But what we find is that the middle of the country actually held on to the art form longer. And I think that there's some interesting reasons for that. Rose LaRose picked Toledo. Rose LaRose picked Toledo for interesting reasons. She actually originally really wanted to buy a theater in Cincinnati when she retired. She only retired in 1958 because her mother, who traveled with her across the circuit for her entire career, had become ill. And she felt that if she opened her own theater and stayed put, she could take better care of her mom. She wanted to live in Cincinnati. She had performed in Cincinnati dozens and dozens of times and had a great relationship with the press there. But the theater she was interested in purchasing was not available. The town hall in Toledo was. The town hall had had many names, and it had been a theater for, I don't know, 50 or 60 years at least before Rose LaRose purchased it, and it had had a lot of lifetimes in it. This is actually a quote from Paula Shoup. This is an article that was I found in the archive here. This newspaper is called The Byline, and I haven't been able to find much information on it, including the date, but it's from Holland, Ohio. Paula Shoup interviews Rose, and she writes, Miss LaRose seems to feel that Toledo is the right size city, large enough to have the facilities of a metropolis, yet small enough to allow her to live at a slower pace. It was through her fondness of boating, having spent several vacations in the area, and the fact that there was an available theater in this city, which led her to settle here. This might seem obvious, like, okay, it was available and that's where she ended up. But Rose LaRose choosing Toledo determines a lot of what happens in the city of Toledo for several decades. And because it was LaRose, not just any burlesque performer, I think burlesque has a different legacy. Even now, I recently got to visit Toledo, and I spoke to a lot of residents who had either met Rose or whose older brothers and sisters had knew Rose, or someone who'd grown up down the street from her. And she had a profound influence on the city itself. Really quickly, I want to show you one of the things that really matters when we talk about the history of Rose LaRose, is what happened in Toledo. So as urban renewal hit the country, but particularly the Midwest, a lot of old buildings got demolished to make way for new roadways and new public buildings. This map, this illustration here on the right, is from the Toledo Blade in 1999, but what it does is it shows you a number of historical buildings that had been there for a very long time that were then just taken away. Among them, the number 5, number 11, number 13 were all theaters, other theaters, not the town hall. Number 2, circled in yellow here on the right, that was the town hall theater. After urban renewal demolished the town hall, which is a much more complicated and interesting story, Rose LaRose moved to the Esquire Theater, which prompted a whole bunch of other problems. And eventually she had to take a court case all the way to the Supreme Court of Ohio. That is a fascinating story. Not the story I'm going to tell you today, but it's a great story. This is actually a picture of the town hall. This was her first theater. But now what I want to do is move you into thinking specifically about a few pieces that I found in the archive. So we're going to look specifically at the summer of 1969. Just a few things to remember. This is just from American history only. I thought about it. Here are some of the things that were happening in 1969 in the summer. The Stonewall Rebellion, the Apollo 11 moon landing, John Lennon and Yoko Ono's Bed-In, and in which they recorded Give Peace a Chance. US troops are finally being drawn down in Vietnam. Woodstock Festival happens. The Manson murders happen. The Zodiac killer spree. And this is a little more local and I think interesting, given its proximity to Toledo. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland catches fire as a result of excessive pollution. At the time, Toledo is impacted by rapidly shifting industry. It's also heavily impacted by a lot of the racial unrest and a number of protests resulting in riots and violence against the African-American community in Detroit and also in Toledo in 1967. So it has been a tumultuous few years in Toledo already. I think that's interesting context. There you go. I want to talk about this lady. This is Pat, a hippie strippy. These are some photos from the archive here. These, I believe, although I don't have much context, I know that they were in Rose LaRose's belongings, which we have a lot of her papers from her time working and producing burlesque. And I believe that these are headshots that she was sent or that she herself took potentially, and I'll tell you why that may be. But these are images of a performer who went by Pat the Hippie Strippy. So some of the items that I specifically have been looking at, and this is where the material culture of my work is starting to emerge. I want to show you a couple images and I want to tell you what I think they mean. So this is something called the Esquire Theater Taped Music Rundowns. And it is a notebook that Rose kept herself. It's hard to read her handwriting in that image. It's my camera, not her handwriting. But in this notebook, she took a ton of notes about specifically what performers were using in their acts in terms of track listing. She lists which reels they're going to use. She orders them all and puts cues in and dates and dancers' names. So I want to show you. This, by the way, is just an incredible resource because it does a lot of things. I've been trying to reconstruct the playlists on Spotify. When they're available, I will send a link to Dr. Cattleman. And if you're interested, let me know. But I'm hoping to just make them available so that you can kind of hear the sound of the Esquire Theater on any given night in the 60s. But here's an image on the left from the book. This is Rose LaRosa's handwriting. I know there's a lot of information here, but what I can show you or tell you is that on the far left, you can see the number of moments, scenes, she called them scenes, that we would have seen in the show. There were group numbers, there was an overture at the beginning, there was an intermission. They would frequently, by the time they got to the Esquire, they would also be showing a movie. By the way, that's not something that just happened in the 60s. By the 1920s or 1930s, adult movies were being shown alongside burlesque performances frequently. You can then see next to the numbers, you can see the number or the name of each dancer. Dawn Wesley, Maria Italy, Helen of Troy, Blanca King, Pat the Hippie Strippy is number 10. Meaning that she is likely, in this case, the headliner, because the headliner would have been featured closer to the end. And then what you see are the 3 songs, sometimes 4, listed for each dancer. If you look all the way over to the right, it will actually tell you what artist is being used if it's known. And this one doesn't have as much because a lot of this music was new, but in the middle, it would have the real number. Because they would put all the music on a single reel. So you can see the dances that that Pat was choosing for this. So I have been looking at this notebook to be completely transparent since 2009, and I couldn't quite figure out what it meant really until more recently. And I want to show you a couple more images. So here's a close-up. Zorba's Dance, Clever People and Grocers. I think that's what it says. Seduction of the Virgin Princess and Tighten Up Your Wig. Those were her song choices. So very recently, the Theater Research Institute was able to acquire some additional materials that are now part of the McKay collection. And these are 2 of those forms. The one here on the left is a form that was from Rose LaRosa's production office. And it essentially was sent to each dancer or to her agent. And they would list who's coming in and what songs they want in what order. Now they list tunes here. And the other document, it said trailers. Trailer was the term that was used by dancers. Usually a dancer would dance to 3 songs. Sometimes it'd be 1 fast, 1 slow, one fast again, but it would vary the tempo in order to kind of tell a story. But so this form in this new acquisition tells me that actually all this information is what ended up in her notebook. This second one on the, oh, I'm sorry, this is the same document. There's another document that isn't listed here, but it has props. It lists all the props. And then there's another one that has all of the set elements needed. So essentially, dancers coming in would send this off and say what music they wanted to use. They have a note here, be sure that not more than one girl will use the same tune. Any girl bringing in her own tape must name her selections and in the order of playing so that we will not have a conflict with some other girl's selections. And then they list rehearsal time. All girls must be on time to listen to their music before showtime. These are also part of that recent acquisition in the McKay collection. So on the far left, you have a note, and I know it's not super easy to read, but that is a note from Pat the Hippie Strippy. And Pat is asking Tom, who, if I understand correctly, was a technician who worked for Rose. But she lists the songs. The first track is from on Zorba's album, Zorba's song, but I don't want it that long. Could you cut it off when it has something to go? It's a time to go, and begins to go into the very, very fast strain again. That should have it about or less, 4 minutes or less. This is the kind of thing I've been doing all month, is trying to read people's handwriting. So Pat shares in here specifically what she's interested in performing to. This second picture is the back of her note, which is the ad that was suggested for Pat's performance. This was going to be the ad that would potentially run in the theater. And all the way over on the right, you actually have Rose LaRose's notes about the Esquire ad and what it should look like, how it should be positioned. We see a note for Thor at the top, who is designing these for the paper. And at the bottom, Rose gave her phone number. First time I've seen that. And actually, I didn't see these until today. So it's one of the reasons I'm still going, wow, what does that say? But I'm going to show you what the end result of this was. So another item I'm looking at, the Esquire Theater Scrapbook. This is another item from Rose's own personal papers that were acquired by Chuck McKay. This lists from June 21st, 1968 to January 22nd, 1970, Esquire Theater. In it, Rose LaRose very meticulously notes every single show. She puts the ad, she numbers it, she makes notes. She said sometimes she'll say the Esquire got that wrong. It was actually this person, or the date is wrong. And she'll say, make a note, check records. And she was keeping absolutely meticulous notes. I think it's really interesting that she was doing this. She also put all of the press, anytime her name was mentioned or the theater was mentioned. This is the actual ad for Pat the Hippie Strippy as it's being revised. So this is from inside that book. But that's not Pat on the right. That's actually Joyce Bishop. So what originally, it seems to me that Joyce Bishop was probably scheduled to perform, and then Joyce Bishop couldn't perform. And so they were working on a replacement ad in which most of this was going to stay the same, but they were going to put a new image in over Joyce. The papers in the archive are really interesting because there are so many ads where Rose has written specific notes about the borders and about the dancer and what part of the dancer we should see and the name. And it's very, very meticulous. And the fact that she kept all of that is very interesting to me. This is what the image ended up looking like. Pat, the hippie strippy, held over. When they say held over, they mean that she was there for a second week. She'd actually been there the week before, and I have copies of that too. Diana King with Helen of Troy, Don Wesley, Honey Child Wilder, Maria Italy, and Top Belly Laugh Comics, Bob Ferguson and company. And then they show you what when the performances were, and then it's been cut off here at the end, but you can actually see down at the bottom where you could park. At the top, you'll notice it says Rose LaRosa's Esquire Theater. And I think that's interesting because throughout her time as a burlesque producer, she always put her name above the name of the theater. And before that, it was Rose LaRosa's Town Hall. But before she inherited the Town Hall, it was just Town Hall. And I thought that that was interesting, given her dislike originally for her name and then her embrace of the name and what it meant to her as an entrepreneur. So I want to show you just a couple more things. So this is these are the stage sets, and I didn't realize again what this album was initially, but I found this in the collection, and I opened it, and every page looks like the image in the middle, where you can see a Polaroid of a set, and on the right captions, mostly typed, sometimes handwritten, that list every single prop. The date in which that set was used, the performer that used it, any props that were rented. Things that are in red often mean that they belong to the performer, and that's indicated and noted here. But she did this for every single show. And what you actually see in both of these images, these are both featuring Pat the Hippie Strippy. The one on the bottom, on the left image, the very bottom image is hers, and the one on the top on the right image is also hers from week to week in June of 1969. You can see this is a close-up of that image. I find this particularly interesting, given that it's 1969, given that Pat the Hippie Strippy is the feature, and this is her set. I wish I could see it. I wish I could know what that show looked like, but the theme was Stars and Stripes Forever. And you can see in red that anything in red belonged to Pat herself, meaning that the dancer herself was bringing some of her own props, which I think is significant. There's a 1964 article in which the Civic Theater in Ann Arbor came actually to see the Town Hall, not the Esquire. And they met with Rose LaRose, who was showing them around and talking about the stagecraft at the Town Hall. And I wanted to quote a couple things from that article that I think are very telling. And that will be my last bit for today. This is from that article. Quote, "Only the finest materials are used in constructing elaborate fabric drops and set pieces." Quote, "We can't have the audience distracted by the curtains or the props," Miss LaRose said. "These things have got to look right under strongly colored lights," end quote. And this is the end of that same article. Quote, "As they were escorted out past the locked stage doors through the silent house and into the photograph-adorned lobby by Miss LaRose, the Civic Theater visitors were impressed chiefly at the fact that her theater was more like any other theater than it was different. Lines, lights, girls, stand-up baggy pants comedians, curtains, drops, and costumes all had that indescribable bittersweet air that only a playhouse can impart." The reason I am so stuck on this is the surprise with which this author thinks of LaRose as a theater maker. And what I think is so interesting is the meticulousness with which this woman, who was working at the intersection, frankly, of a precarious kind of women's labor, in which some of the women that she was employing were actively also engaged in sex work, openly or admittedly. But many also went on to have theatrical careers or became business owners. There's a way in which the sense of precarity, I think, speaks to the way in which the women in burlesque are talked about, particularly by the time we get to the 1950s and the 1960s. The thing I don't have time to tell you about, but I hope you'll visit the TRI and look at it, in the McKay collection, we have Charles McKay and his partner, James Skipper. They did a series of interviews as sociologists with a number of dancers in 1968 backstage at the Roxy in Cleveland. These dancers were on the same circuit that Rose LaRose's theater was in Toledo. And in fact, many of them mention Rose LaRose as one of their mentors. They talk about liking to go specifically to the Toledo because they felt the production value was better or they felt safer there. But in those interviews, the dancers talk about the life of being a performer on the circuit and what it meant. How were they paying bills? How were they supporting their families, caring for their children, but also achieving their artistic and career aspirations? And so for me, as I'm stepping back from this month of research, the thing that's really been impressed upon me is how much labor, unseen labor, unacknowledged production value went into burlesque, even as late as the 1960s, when, frankly, if you read anything about burlesque, you will find it gets very quickly dismissed as smut or as prurience or, you know, as nothing. I'm going to stop there so that you have some time, hopefully, to ask a few questions. I could talk forever, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was great. How interesting is that? Really wonderful. You really brought that archive alive. And we do have some questions for you here. So let me read these out for you and we can do some live answers. One of the questions says, it seems that in the 20s and 30s, burlesque performers were on the same celebrity status as Hollywood stars like Marilyn Monroe, Clara Bow, etc. I feel like nowadays the stardom has decreased and the only performer I can think of off the top of my head is Dita Von Teese. What do you think led to the dip in popularity?
That's a great question. It's an interesting question. So I think you could say that the burlesque is no longer as distinct an art form as it probably was at a particular time. A lot of what you would see in burlesque performers, you see in people who do many other things now. So there are probably celebrities that you know and think of. Maybe they're people on TikTok, maybe they are YouTube sensations, or they're people who are featured on So You Think You Can Dance, or right. So I think there are probably people who in previous decades, generations, we would have thought of as being part of a burlesque scene that are now, that kind of work is more incorporated. The distinct field of burlesque or this distinct style has become somewhat romanticized and I don't want to say fetishized because that feels dismissive. It feels like it's become potentially limited by its need to be sort of historical, whereas burlesque always was trying to be ahead. Now, in some ways, it's a little bit more nostalgic, but I could be persuaded that that's not true. Anyway, hope that answers the question.
That's great. Another question or comment. You mentioned Rose LaRose's obvious patriotism. Can you tell us some more about that?
So yeah, thank you. A number of things come to mind. She is the first generation American. Her family immigrated in the very, very beginning of the 20th century. She was raised during the Depression. She came of age during the Depression and entered the profession during the Great Depression. Her father died by the time she was probably I think 24 maybe, or 26. And so it's clear that she had to be her mother's primary financial support, but also that from an early age, she felt a sense of ownership over who she was. There seems to be an embrace of what I would call her version of the American dream, but also frequently in her act itself, she would reference Americanness. During World War II, for example, she was famous for basically holding the audience hostage and refusing to take off more clothes until they bought war bonds, as an example. Or she would take the entire company of performers whenever she toured during the war to whatever the nearest Red Cross was, and they would donate blood. That happened, for instance, when she was touring at the Alvin in Minneapolis in the 40s. So those are a couple examples. There's a lot more I could say about that. But that's where it started.
Great, thank you. Another question. Do we know what her relationship was like with the dancers when she owned the theaters? Was it like a drag mother mentorship relationship, or more distant? Is the theater maker? And what clues do the archives give you about that?
This is such a nice question, and one that I'm hoping is a whole chapter in my book, because I think what's interesting about Rose LaRose, and I don't think she's alone in this, but there is a kind of mentorship that happens, I think, in burlesque that I would not say is dissimilar to a drag mother sort of having a house, but perhaps more businesslike in the way that it's focused. There's a number of performers, one of whom I knew on Facebook, Marinka. She has since passed away, but Marinka used to talk about how Rose LaRose had been her earliest mentor and how she had gifted her signature performance. We can argue about whether or not that was Rose LaRose's signature performance, or whether it was Marinka's, or whether either of them could actually lay claim to it. But there was a way in which repeatedly Rose LaRose was thought to have taught dancers, helped name dancers, sent them to other places to learn from choreographers or to get practice. And there are pictures. There are a lot of pictures in the archive of her with other dancers and performers. There's a rumor that she had romantic or sexual relationships with several dancers. I think it's not, there's a lot we can't know, right? But I think it's pretty clear that Rose LaRose had a queer identity and a queer sexual orientation. However, she would have characterized that.
Great. Was it common for a dancer to transition into director or a theater owner like Rose LaRose?
This is something that I think I am seeing as a trend. I thought it was pretty unique when I started looking, and what I have learned, is that this is actually that the women in burlesque, like the women in many fields, are hidden, but they were doing a lot of labor. And so, yes, there were other dancers who owned their own clubs or bought clubs where they themselves had worked. Blaze Star is the one that's coming to mind right now. There's a lot of interesting information out there. There's not a lot written about it, but there are a number of women who began as dancers and ended up being producers or choreographers, some of them costume designers.
Great. The questions are rolling in here. We've really got some interesting stuff going on. Were burlesque shows segregated by race? And how did that change over time during Rose's career?
That's a really important question. So by the time Rose LaRose starts in the 30s, there were some integrated burlesque shows. Sometimes they were referred to as black and tans. That was the term that was used. That's not the only way in which you could have performers of color featured in a show with a mostly white cast. One of the things that you could see in early archival material, like early Billboard magazines, is that it would list the performers and it would only make mention of race if a performer wasn't white. So that in some ways could give you some clues about it. By the time Rose has, by the 50s, there's a lot of integration. in most of the country in terms of dancers. And there are a lot of dancers of color. Did they receive the same kinds of accolades and treatment as white dancers? I don't think that that could be said. There's also in the 40s and 50s, there's unsurprisingly, and it's not a new phenomenon in America, but there is an increased, I would say, Orientalism or fetishization, particularly of Asian women, given what was happening during World War II. There was some of that was happening, and you can see it really heavily reflected in the iconography that dancers themselves were choosing to do. So you had a lot of women of color who were working burlesque dancers, who were touring, who were making money, who had a large skill set, but who were frequently marketing themselves, right, as of the East, or, you know, sort of using sort of fetishized language. And it's easy to understand why they would have to do that. Because of the time in which they were working. And they certainly weren't alone in that, right? Because Broadway was doing the same thing, many of the same ways. By the time we get to Toledo, Rose LaRose is employing many dancers of color. Some of the dancers that she mentored or knew the best were African-American, including Tony Elling, who actually appeared with Pat the Hippie Strippy in one of the 2 weeks that I mentioned in 1969. Tony Elling, by the way, went on to have an amazing career, and I believe I got to see her perform once.
Oh, that's so cool. You mentioned that burlesque performers sometimes also engaged in sex work. Was that entwined with your work at the theater? In other words, might they meet clients there or do sex work under their stage name, or was that strictly kind of a side gig?
Well, this is a great question, and a question I don't have a full answer to. But one thing I can share is that, so in the McKay Skipper interviews that are done with dancers, now these interviews are dated in a way, right? Because they were written in a different time, and they are summaries of the notes. They're not exact transcripts. So some of the things include observations from McKay and Skipper from their perspective as, frankly, white men writing from a social sciences or sociological perspective. And they are writing in what they call the field of deviance, meaning a deviation from the norm. So that included a number of things, including stripping, sex work, what they refer to as lesbianism, drug use, and so on. So there's a way in which a whole bunch of things that don't go together got kind of squished together. So when you look at those interviews, you will see questions about, for instance, what they call prostitution. And a number of women shared, the way they asked the question is, how many women would you say, what percentage of dancers would you say engage in prostitution while also on the circuit? And most of the women say, oh, I don't know, maybe half, maybe 50%, maybe 75%. A few of them say, I myself have done that. A few of them say they have been arrested for it. A number of them say they've only done it when they had to make rent or when they were really desperate. A few of them said, no way, never. So it seems that it was a mechanism of survival. I would not be romanticizing it as like an empowered act. Though it might be for some sex workers, I would say generally that is not the tone that you receive from reading these interviews. By the way, all the dancers' names are redacted in those interviews to protect their identity.
Okay, I think we got time for maybe one more question. I'm sorry we're not getting to all of them, but you can always get in touch with Elizabeth.
Yeah, email me, please. I'll put my email in the chat.
Oh, that's fantastic. You can put your email in chat, and we're going to anxiously await that book that's going to be coming out. But so here we go with our last question, basically. So first of all, it says, Elizabeth, I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. Could you talk more about national identity, particularly American identity, and how it relates to burlesque as a genre and for Rose LaRose specifically? I'm also curious about the American flag and Ohio as symbols of a kind of American consciousness. what does American identity look like? In relation to the first question, then, how has American identity and burlesque, or the marketing and work of women's bodies, changed in the decades since? And that question is in the Q&A. So again, if you want to take a look at it.
That question is from my current theater chair, Dr. Montweiler. So thank you. I appreciate that question very much. This is a complicated question. Obviously, this is probably the book, Catherine. But okay, a couple things I'm thinking about right now. Back to the question about women of color, for instance, and the way that race is often constructed through the burlesque performance itself. You have a lot of these publicity or headshots, which are in some ways one of the dominant records that remain from burlesque performances. I would call it the residue, because it's not the performance itself. They're these stills that are staged in studios that are then, the majority of those are either autographed and given to the public for collection, for collectors. Or they are distributed via agent in order to get more work. So with that caveat, a lot of those stagings are narratives of identity. So I'm thinking specifically right now about Princess Lahoma as an example of one of many Native women who danced and talked pretty openly about her identity as an Indigenous woman in the United States, and shared her cultural heritage. Now, she shared her cultural heritage, but she also was engaging in an art form in which she's doing a total striptease, except for, let's say, a traditional ceremonial headdress. That's pretty complicated. And I certainly can't speak to, how her community felt about that, or even how she herself felt about that. But a lot of what I'm thinking about right now is the way in which there's a story that we tell about women's bodies, and how they relate to what we expect women to be. So there's a way in which all of these stories are like, that you ask a dancer in any of these interviews, what is your gimmick? And they'll say, oh, well, I do a bubble act, or my thing is this is an expression from burlesque, a talking woman. That's actually an expression, meaning a woman who actually would have lines and scenes, or she would actually speak to the audience and tell jokes. That wasn't actually always standard. So this idea that that in order for a woman to be seen, she had to sort of have a narrative of identity and a gimmick that framed her sexuality, but that ultimately it was her sexuality that we were returning to. I don't think I'm answering your question fully, but this is where my brain is going right now in terms of thinking about how American identity gets wrapped up in burlesque. Burlesque to me is just a lens through which to understand the way we express identity in an American context. I'm sure the same could be said in other countries. I'm in my one little narrow window.
Well, we are out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in this wonderful webinar with Dr. Elizabeth Wellman. And again, her email is in the chat if you've got more questions, because I apologize that we couldn't get through them all. And thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone. I did just put the email in the chat to everyone. I hope you can see it. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time today.